really important that I can break in and go from there. Now, to get started, our speaker this afternoon is Lieutenant John Anderson with the Onondaga County Sheriff's Office, and he's going to be talking about situational awareness and diffusing techniques. And one of the things good is I will hide myself so I don't distract you, and you can listen to Lieutenant Anderson. It's all yours, John.
Okay, thanks for having me. It's nice to get out of the office once in a while. This is a very popular topic that is very useful in the work environment where I work. Just a quick introduction. I've been with the department for 35 years, actually 36 years this year. I've worked in a lot of different capacities, but this topic has really come into play with me in the significance of it in the work environment that we work at. My unit is the security for the downtown business complex and all the county office buildings in downtown Syracuse. We have about 3,000 county workers in different departments that work out of there, and about 220,000 clientele coming through just Department of Social Services alone. And that doesn't even include the other clientele that come into adult protective, child protective, that type of thing. And what I found when I took over this unit in 2015 was we have a clientele that are highly at risk in a lot of different ways. They're at risk in a lot of stress level in terms of their health, financial backgrounds, mentally, emotionally stressed, heightened stress level on the clientele. And when I first took over the unit, I found that there was a lot of calls that my officers would respond to that they really didn't need to respond to because the workforce, some of the county personnel didn't have the training and the tools to diffuse stressful situations and encounters. And so I found that, I really need to help them in the community, the workforce, and help them have the tools to be able to diffuse situations without involving my officers. So what I did is I went next door to our jail facility, which is one of the most stressful environments that you have to work in a jail environment. It's very stressful for the staff, for the inmates, for the family members, and for the resources that we have working in that jail. And so I wanted to find out how did they train their staff to be able to encounter stressful encounters and then also to have responses that diffuse them. And I found that they actually have a strategy and a technique that's trained in the jails across New York State. So it's a week-long course that they train correctional officers. So I was able to take that and put it into about a half-hour, 45-minute presentation, and I started training county workers on these techniques. And I found out that it not only works in the jails, but it works in really any business district. So we started training county workers into it, and I know it's very successful because since 2016 and until last year when I did my statistics, about 15% of the calls that my officers were called in were what we consider to be confrontational, where we anticipated either physical or verbal confrontations. And once we started to employ these techniques and train people on how to use them other than my officers, what we found is less than 1% are actually getting arrested. Which I thought was pretty amazing. So 15% of calls are confrontational and less than 15% lead to arrest. Something successful is being done in order to reduce the tension level where the services are provided. And the other interesting thing about this, why I know this works, is none of those arrests in all of those years were repeat offenders. They were first timers coming into the building. So that tells me that these techniques really do work. So what I'd like to do first, if you want to go to the next slide, I want to cover some myths that we have, and I want to show you a little bit about how law enforcement and first responders think. And when we talk about this, I'm going to open up a little bit of situational awareness before I actually get into the diffusing techniques as a methodology. And some of the myths that we have that I found county workers, had were that the client and the customer comes first. And that's certainly not the case when an encounter becomes threatening to that level. You and your partner, your coworkers, and the other people around come first when it reaches that level. So that's one occupational myth that I want the people to think about getting away from. The other thing is has to come with when you're comfortable in your workplace and you're trained and experienced, and law enforcement does not believe in this myth, and that is this is just another routine encounter. There's no such thing as a routine encounter, especially when you're getting into a difficult situation and a stressful situation. because of the things we'll talk about in a minute, there's just no such thing. You can't fall into that complacency a little bit. And the other one is this: when you're comfortable in your workplace, you're familiar with the workplace, people have the idea that this won't happen to me. And I'm telling you, in law enforcement, we don't have this. We don't believe in this myth. It might happen to me, and it might happen to me today in my workplace. And the other thing that I found that law enforcement, again, does not believe in this myth is in the workplace, I'm authorized to be here. I have the right to be here. I have a responsibility to my workplace, and I shouldn't have to retreat. And you might have to. And some encounters where these diffusing techniques don't work, and if it gets into a threatening situation, you might have to think about, it's okay for me to leave. It's okay for me to retreat and find a way out. So those are some of the occupational myths that I've had to encounter with with county workers and caseworkers, where they get caught up in a situation where they were caught up, with this mindset. So those are just some occupational myths I wanted to throw at you real quick. You can go ahead to the next slide if you want. These are three factors that have an effect on any kind of situation awareness that I want you to, that's my phone ringing over there already. Hope it's not my guys, but these things are the three things that can affect a response in any particular situation. And all of these are can be manipulated to one degree or another, for better or for worse. So the first one is the individual factors, or the human factor. The second one is the environmental factor. And the last one is the task. What are the circumstances that exist at any given time? And this comes real important at the first phases of the diffusing techniques. And that's why I wanted to take a minute and talk about them. You can go ahead to the next slide if you'd like to. And let's just look at the individual or the human factor. This has to do with you. It also has to do with the person you're encountering or the persons you're encountering. And it also has to do with the other people you could potentially bring into the equation. It has to do with maturity, their experience level, their emotional, their stress tolerance at any given time, their span of attention. It has to do with their health, sleep deprivation, coping mechanisms, intoxication, medications. Are they on their meds? Are they off their meds? A good example of this is my boy is a captain with the 3rd Cavalry, and when he was in Afghanistan, my first week when I talked about him, he goes, Dad, my guys are also awesome. They're a lot more experienced than I am in a lot of different things. And he goes, but I'm really worried about the sleep deprivation and the lack of sleep that my guys are getting. So he was very focused on addressing those kind of issues. And they also have to do with the personality traits, attitudes, belief systems, and things like this. So in the stress tolerance, I think is really good. Where I can best say that is you've seen it experienced, I'm sure, at times when you were at work, when you just knew that maybe the person you work with shouldn't be at work today. I dealt with these kind of situations in the past, and even in my world, when we deal with trained, experienced law enforcement officers, I've been involved in several shooting incidents, active shooting situations where law enforcement and first responders showing up to the scenes really shouldn't have been there because their stress tolerance at that particular level just wasn't ready. So these are the kind of things you want to look at and pay attention to in your life and into the responses of the people you were dealing with when we talk about assessment, and also why you want to bring other people into the equation at certain times. Sometimes we forget about that. I had one encounter with a young girl before the business opens. An individual, a threat individual, came into the building, and she didn't expect to run into him that early before we were open to the public. And when they did have an encounter in an elevator lobby, she knew to get away from him. And she barricaded herself into a restroom, which was a good move on her part, but this was a guy who didn't recognize boundaries. And what she forgot about is just walking back into her office area where there were 20, 25 county workers who could have come to her assistance. And that's a good example where I want you to think about the human factor. You're not in this alone. I want you to constantly think about other people you can bring into the equation to assist you. Coworkers, supervisors, first responders, that type of thing. So we'll talk more about this as we go along. You can go ahead and move to the next one. When we talk about positioning and posturing later as the diffusing techniques, these are a little bit what we're talking about. The tools and equipment that you have. Are you familiar with your equipment? What is the condition of the equipment that you have available to you? The environment factors does have a source to play in terms of Is it your environment? Is it their environment? Are these offsite encounters in someone else's home? Or are they coming into your workplace? Has a lot to do with the stress level. You'll hear me talk about that when we get into the diffusing techniques. But it also has to do with the resources and support you have, your management, outside support you can bring in. Training, policies and procedures, I'll hit on that a little bit, and why policies and procedures are really important for us to have in place as a planned resource for us to rely on in terms of how to address situations. And the physical environment itself has a lot to do with diffusing techniques and strategies as well too. So that's just another factor I wanted to get into. And the last one, if you want to move to the next slide. And the task, the specific factors, what's the situation that presents itself at any given time? A lot of it, sometimes we can step back a little bit, and sometimes we don't have that resource. The time is an element, and sometimes there's an emergency type situation involved. Information, what information do we have available? Does it conflict with immediate expectations of the clients or the people we deal with or not? We'll talk about this when we get into questions and answer phase of it. Is it emotionally charged, at that time? And information overload. In a stressful situation, a lot of times people are stressed because of the lack of information or an information overload coming in. But again, if we can diffuse the situations at any different stages of a confrontation, again, some of this can be reduced. And so we do have an opportunity to manipulate this to some degree, one way or the other. All right, you can move on to the next slide if you like. Why it's important for us to talk about these things and for us to look for opportunities to expand beyond this is basically that first remark in there. People will react to a stressful situation depending on how you're trained. And a lot of training, it could be formal training, could be informal training, but a lot of it is practice, what you do out there on your own. And so when we talk about these techniques today, it's to introduce the strategy and the methodology to it, but I want you to take advantage of and practice this in your field. Look for the opportunities to share with your other coworkers on where this worked, where this didn't work, these techniques didn't work, and what you're doing by then is practicing and training yourself. And what that does for you is fosters a quicker response on your part and a desired planned response that you're looking for, which is basically to minimize risk and injury for you in a threatening situation. These kind of things can help put you at an advantage for survivability or escapability in some type of situation. So this kind of training is really, really practical and important, but you should look for the opportunities to carry it on beyond this. You can go ahead to the next one if you like. Being prepared can make the difference whether or not one is a passive victim or witness in a particular situation, especially if you're one of those people that are on the sidelines when an encounter happens between you and a coworker, for example. Or it can make the difference whether one acts with a sense of denial, a helplessness, or one acts with aggression, decisiveness, or composure. And there's a thing that you can look up a little bit when we talk about being prepared, the difference between the sense of helplessness and stuff. When we deal with a stressful situation, our brain has our frontal lobe is what takes into effect on how we respond. And there's two ways potentially it could happen. One is a bottom-up thinking, which is the bottom part of the frontal lobe fosters an emotional response. And that's basically fight, flight, or surrender. You've heard that. That's that one when we talk about sense of denial, helplessness, and that kind of response. And that's really the only response you have. But if you have a trained response, that is what we call top-down thinking. And the top part of your frontal lobe is what addresses people in terms of a planned response. And that can take over the emotional response. And that's what we want when we get into training like this, when we get into reading and training yourself into good practices and stuff. And that's what we want in terms of policies and procedures, if we're familiar with them. We want a planned response, a top-down thinking. That's how the military thinks. That's how law enforcement thinks. That's how first responders think. A planned response that can overcome the emotional response. And again, it makes a difference whether one acts with a planned response towards a desired outcome. And that is reducing risk. So you can go on to the next one if you like. It's all about mindset. This is the most important tool that you have. It's an offensive tool that you can have. It's a defensive tool as well. It's formed by experience, education, and of course that's training. formal training, informal training. And I put this one thing in here about unintentional blindness because that's an important thing you might want to look up at, for. If you ever saw the show Mind Games on TV, they cover one whole episode on this. And what this is when we deal with situations, the human animal, one thing we tend to do is spotlight. We focus our attention on what we're paying attention to, like a phone conversation. That's why phone and cell phone driving and stuff is so dangerous, because people lose sense of the driving environment and start to focus on their mind's eye, what they're talking about. But this thing, unintentional blindness, training and experience can overcome this phenomenon. And unintentional blindness is basically this. People will not see something in their mind's eye, in their situational awareness, if they don't expect it. So if you walk in there every day thinking this won't happen to me, and this is just a routine encounter, those myths that we talked about, you aren't expecting a threat. And if you don't expect it, you won't see it until it's too late or it manifests itself. But cops come into, like, for example, law enforcement comes into the idea that everything is a threat. Every unknown is a threat. Every encounter is a potential threat. And everybody who views us as a potential threat. And so we don't have this unintentional blindness. We expect a threat, so we see it. We recognize it earlier, and it allows us to respond in a way quicker that, again, will give us that pre-wire mental, emotional, and physical response that we need. And it can influence the response time and the demeanor. And when we talk about the diffusing techniques, we're not only going to be thinking about our demeanor, but the demeanor of the people we're interacting with as well. So that's just a little bit on mindset. You can go on to the next one if you like. One thing that I think will help us to assess the situations, whether this technique is working or not. People don't think about this too much, but this is how law enforcement trains in terms of viewing a threat level or a stress level. And we divide stress and threats into several levels to help us, again, equate what's our next step? Where do we go from here? And I just want to introduce this real quick, and you'll all understand this when I present it to you this way. The lowest level of threat, even though I put it on top, sorry about that, is a psychological intimidation. That is basically, and you know what that is. That's posturing, positioning, that's expression, tone. When somebody comes across intimidating, that's really a low level. And that's where these diffusing techniques, you want to cut in at that point and start using them to stop the threat at that level. The next level, if these are not working, is verbal threats, and that's when somebody starts to communicate verbally a threat to you, either by word or just by sounds and stuff like that. But once they start getting verbal, that's the second level of threat that we have. The next one is basically a passive resistance, and that's when people, after they start getting verbal, once you start giving direction to them, if they start to not respond to you, and they're passive, they're not aggressive, but they start to not do what you ask them to do, move over here, listen to me for a minute, quiet down for a little bit. That's basically another level, and if it doesn't get cut off at that point or diffused, then it's going to probably lead to the next level, which we call defensive resistance. That's when, for example, an officer comes into somebody and starts to move them along, and they pull away, that type of thing. They're defensive, but they're still resistance. And if the next step is going to be aggressive, probably active aggression, and if it gets to that point, then in our mind's eye, it's deadly physical force. So this is why we try to identify levels of threat in terms of what's working, what's not working, what's our next step. And when it gets to deadly physical force or active aggression, in our world, there's no such thing as a fair fight. If you're in a fair fight, you're in trouble. So that's just a little bit of cop humor and stuff like that. But I just want to cover these levels of threat, just so we can, when we talk about assessing these techniques, whether they're working or not, we can realize whether we need to step away, engage, or not engage, or call in other resources to assist them on there. So that's just something I wanted to cover for people a little bit. You can go on to the next slide if you like. And again, I just wanted to cover real quick policies and procedures. Real important to update them, real important to find out what other like businesses do in your world. What are their policies and procedures? What's working for them? For example, when I took over this assignment, I found that there was no bomb threat procedure for a government building. And I'm like, holy mackerel, there's got to be something we do in here. So I started to look at other institutions, educational institutions, military institutions, educational institutions. What do you guys use for a building in terms of your bomb threats? And sure enough, we found some great information and put one together. And the first bomb threat we had it not only solved in 15 minutes and had an arrest made and be able to, we didn't even have to clear the building. No one even knew that the threat was even made because of the techniques we had. But that's just one quick example where we follow our workplace policies and procedures, and that terms of harassment policies, in terms of reporting procedures, and workplace violence procedures. Those really have to be in place and that we understand them, because those are all about diffusing stress also, and reporting is really important as well. Two things happen if we have problems with stress, stressful encounters with individuals, whether this be clientele or coworkers. If it's not addressed in any way and not reported, the conduct is going to become more frequent and it's going to become worse. And so when we talk about stressful encounters, policies and procedures are just something we want to pay attention to. All right, let's get into diffusing techniques and have some fun on the strategy here. You can go on the next slide. This is our Justice Center downtown, 600, we house 600 clientele in here, if you want to look at it that way. This is where this technique came from, these policies. It's actually a methodology in terms of engaging stress and using these techniques. These techniques are actually trained in by Commission of Corrections in New York State. All of our jail corrections officers are trained in this sort of technique, and it really works. And it's really kind of interesting when I come into it, and when I talk about the topics here, nothing is going to be really surprisingly new to you, because you've all practiced these techniques one way or another in your adult life and your professional life, but few people have thought about the methodology and why these things work to diffuse tension. So it works in our jails. And it's going to work in your place environment as well too. So you can move on to the next slide if you like. And it's all about communication. It's a tool for managing behavior, and there's two parts of it. There's verbal communication and nonverbal communication, and it's basically that's basically it. It's to engage a stress or stressful encounter and diffuse it at a communication level before it becomes an active threat, those higher levels of threat, for example. And that's what it's all about. There's an underlying current in here, and the underlying current is, I should have put a slide in here for this, but I didn't even think about it. But through this nonverbal and verbal techniques and strategies, what we're going to do is we're going to show recognition, attention, and we're going to validate people, and the people that are angry and coming into us. And once you do that, this underlying current and all these techniques that I'll be introducing to you, these nonverbal and verbal techniques, are to show that. That's the underlying current. We're showing recognition, attention, and validation. And once that is done and people feel that they've been validated, recognized, and respected, a lot of tension just gets dumped, just like turning a bucket, because there's no reason for them to act out anymore, because they have been recognized. They are getting the attention that they deserve. And it opens the pathways to more improved communication and continued dialogue. So let's go on to the next slide. Well, let's take one at a time. We'll look at communication first, and overall. Now, I don't know who the experts are exactly, but they're coming out of the University of Pennsylvania, and these are what we train in when we get into training officers and detectives in terms of interview techniques, interrogation techniques. I don't care so much about the percentages, but when we look at qualifying them, it's really important to understand that studies have showed that effective human communication breaks down like this. About 7%, or anyway, the least amount of effective communication is actually verbal. Now, anyone who's been married for any set of time knows that that's certainly true. No, I'm just kidding. That's just a domestic joke. But very little effective communication and human communication is actually verbal. And that makes sense if you look at us from the human animal. That's the last thing we developed is communication. We communicated differently on these other two levels first. The next largest effective part of human communication in language anyway, they say 45%. How they came up with that, I don't know. But you certainly understand it's expression and tone. Not what is said, but how it is said makes a huge difference. And you know that when certain phrases and profanity can be used, and when you do it in humor, it's said one way, it's the same phrase, but when you say it a different way in anger, it's expressed totally different with a whole different meaning. So certainly we can understand that. And this part is really the most fun part about the diffusing techniques. Is the most effective communication is actually body language. How we communicate, through our body language, how we posture ourselves, how we position ourselves. And we'll talk a little bit about that. And one tool when we get into it, let me just introduce this real quick before we move on, is one tool that I had is when my boy came back from Afghanistan. He came back from a very angry corner of the world, and I spent 2 weeks with him, and he did very well with it. And but it was a very, very tough time, for him. They actually had more suicides from his unit when they came back and safe than they actually had casualties in combat. So we were talking about all these kind of techniques when he was trying to deal with his soldiers and stuff coming back into domestic life. And while we were in the PX looking at books to study and stuff, I came across this piece, and it was a great book. And you've seen Windows for Dummies, eBay for Dummies, and I actually found one, Body Language for Dummies, and I picked it up and read it on a plane going home, and it's a riot. It's a lot of fun. And I tell every county worker, you should have this book or a body language book on your desk at work and start reading it to try to understand how to use body language a little bit more effectively. So when we talk about these techniques, this human communication, verbal expression, tone, and body language, when we talk about the diffusing techniques, what we're looking at is, number one, pay attention not only on the clientele that you're dealing with, whether it be a coworker or a clientele or something, but you want to pay attention to your body language too. You want to pay attention to your expression and tone and what you're saying too. And that's why we always say in law enforcement, keep it professional. Don't come down to their level. What's happening here when you're in a position of authority, when you're out in the workplace and stuff, you're actually, and what one of the intents is you're to set the example. If this technique starts to work, if people are loud and they're angry and they're verbal, what they're saying is profanity and everything else because they're angry. If you continue to be, professional, keep the level down, and your body language is open and showing respectful and attention, they'll start to mirror you. That's one of the ways you can engage that this is working. When they start to mirror your tone, your expression, your verbiage, and your posturing, that's one of the ways you're hoping that's going to happen. When they start to do that, rapport starts to kick in, and you're starting to take control of the situation. So you can move on to the next one if you like. So let's start with the nonverbal. The other thing about verbal and nonverbal techniques, you don't play one or the other first. This is all up to the situation at time. You play both of these together, but because more people pay attention to the nonverbal part, we'll start with that first. But again, how you engage, either part when we get into these is really up to you and depending on the encounter. The observe and listen part is real critical. Because what you're doing is you're paying attention to those things we talked about earlier. You're paying attention to the people, you have people involved. You're paying attention to the other people potentially involved that are around you. One technique my officers do when they get into a crowd situation, when somebody starts to act out, is they'll step aside a little bit and they'll look around. And what that does is that brings other people into the equation. The individual that you're dealing with realizes, oh my gosh, there's other people around, there's cell phones around. Sometimes they can use that to your advantage. So you want to be paying attention to basically a couple things. What's normal in the situation? What's normal in the person you're dealing with? Or what's abnormal? Is it normal? Is it understandable that they would respond in the way that they're responding, with the tension, with the anger, under the circumstances? And what you're looking for is appearance, you're looking for behavior, you're looking for verbal responses, and you're trying to equate those stress tolerances in the individuals and stuff. And again, with the other people that are around you. What you're doing is, you're trying to assess the situation. Can I handle this? Is this technique working? Or do I need to bring other resources in here? And when you bring other people into the equation, other coworkers, other experiences, supervisors, for example, or even other, outside like first responders and things, what you're doing is you're actually bringing in more experience. different kind of experience, a diversity in terms of training and experience of people who can come in and address these situations and maybe take over a little bit, you know, if the situation isn't working really well. But observing and listening is really important. You're trying to basically assess. You're looking for clues and motivators when you're listening to people. You're listening to what they say, what they're upset about. That's going to be working in some theme dialogues that maybe come along. And the listening part is important because people will tend to cooperate a little bit more if they feel that they're being listened to. It's as simple as that. I'll give you one example. I was talking to a county worker once who was talking about a client who engaged them, coming over their desk, leaning over them, and getting loud and stuff, and they felt very uncomfortable. And one of the things that was happening is just posturing and position, which we'll get into in a minute. The county worker had their side turned, working on their computer, and to them, they didn't feel, the clientele didn't feel that they were being listened to. And just by posturing and positioning, which we'll talk about in a minute, that all they had to do was change their positioning in terms of demonstrating that they were actively listening to this individual. So again, you're during this observe and listening part, you're listening to what they say, giving in that a chance to verbalize what they feel. That is a release in and of itself. It's okay to control people when they're angry and talking to you, and set parameters for them. You know, like for example, tell them, hey, you don't need to swear at me. I'm okay. I'm not going to be swearing at you. I know you're angry and stuff, but it's okay to establish what's acceptable and what's not. Or go ahead and tell them, hey, I'm only a couple feet away from you. I know you're angry and stuff, but I want you to quiet down a little bit. And if you talk on a slow term, low term like that, they actually have to kind of quiet down to listen to what you're saying. So, and again, you're setting that example. So listen, give them the opportunity to vent a little bit. And again, this gives you an opportunity to decide whether I'm going to engage and continue to engage this situation, or I'm going to disengage. I'm going to get out of it, and think about alternative courses of actions. But normally, under normal circumstances, these techniques will work. But if it's somebody who's like, obviously crazy or off their meds, on their meds, and the responses are abnormal, you might want to think about having alternative methods than trying these techniques. You can try them if you'd like to, but there are just some times where they're not going to work. So under the normal circumstances, these techniques will typically work on clientele, coworkers. Doesn't work on supervisors during evaluations, though. No, I'm just kidding. So that's the first stage, is this assessment, observing and listening. And you're paying attention to, again, people around you. You're paying attention to what you're communicating to that individual, trying to focus on showing respect and attention, which we'll get to in a minute. And then you're also looking at the environment that's around too. And we'll get into that next. You can go on to the next phase if you like. There we go. Observing, listening is part of the nonverbal part. And the next part is the positioning and posturing. And this is where you have an opportunity to show confidence, control, and attention. So let's talk about positioning, for example. And while posture, I'll talk about both of them together because they're both kind of, come into place. But some of the things you can do in your positioning and your posturing is to demonstrate attention and respect, is to, like, for example, face somebody. When people are focused on you, whether they're angry or interested in you in some way, that's a positioning. And people look at you that way. They usually don't go off onto a side like this. So one of the things you want to do in your posturing and your positioning is face people one-on-one, square them off like that. That's one thing to do. You want to show openness and respect. So you don't want to be crossing your arms, crossing your legs. You want to be open a little bit, put yourself into a posture that's opening and inviting. And if they are starting to set up a rapport and identify with you, they will mirror that. They will do the same. Eye contact is a really important thing. Boy, that shows really that you're interested in somebody when you show them, the eye contact. And that's difficult to do so you want to try practicing that from time to time. It doesn't work on dogs, though. You make the eye contact with the dogs, that means game's on. So you want to be careful about that. But eye contact is good. Keep in mind, some people, their cultural background is not to make contact when they show respect. So you want to be focused. It doesn't mean that they're being deceptive necessarily or not being respectful. You just got to understand a little bit that might be a way of resigning to you a little bit, in time. So you want to, think about those kind of things. Head nods are good. Sometimes you can, a slow head nod is kind of like, I understand. Certainly people know what this means compared to this, and in your conversations when you're listening to them and having them talk out, by just doing slow nods like that is good. You don't want to be too fast. This is what your supervisor does when you do your self-evaluation, and you're right, you know, if they kind of like, oh, okay, let's get over this. That's just joking a little bit, but so you want to, you know, show those kind of things. The other thing that's interesting that works really well that people don't think about is distance, proximity. And so sometimes if you just lean into somebody when they're talking and listening, that shows I'm interested. That phrase, that movie, that show had me at the edge of my seat. That's exactly what that's all about. You're interested, so it brings you towards it. So sometimes leaning towards somebody, whether you're standing, just leaning in a little bit makes a difference. If you're in a chair, moving to the edge of your seat, moving towards them shows interest. Sitting back, we do this during interview techniques. And sometimes when we want to engage somebody, a suspect, for example, we'll start at a distance. And then as the communication starts to move forward, we'll actually move closer to them, It starts by leaning in. It starts by moving at the edge of the chair, moving the chair forward, and then moving in a little bit. And every time they let you get closer, the rapport becomes a little more intimate. That's why interviews and interrogations are done in small rooms. You can go to the next slide and I'll explain this a little bit. Maybe back up one. I'm sorry about that. I thought I had a slide on proxemics, but we'll stick with, I thought my next slide I had one, but I didn't. Let me talk about distance for a little bit. Distances, number one, gives you a safe zone, so a reaction zone. And so one of the things you can do in a distance is have something between you, whether a desk or something else. Sometimes that can be a communication tool, whether what's acceptable and what's not. We're talking about comfort zones here. We're talking about safety zones a little bit. But when we talk about comfort zones and posturing and positioning in terms of distance, which is a real important part of the human communication that we don't think about sometimes, is those experts out of Pennsylvania say also that there are different levels of acceptability in terms of the rapport that's taking place in the communication. And one of them is intimate distance. And they say that intimate distance is roughly from contact to 18 inches, a foot and a half. That if you're in that space, the conversation is intimate. So what I'm saying is if you're talking to somebody and the rapport is working well and you're with a clientele and the distance is closing a little bit and it's not a threat, I mean, that's usually a good thing. So if you step in a little bit, but keep in mind, within 18 inches, foot and a half might be a little uncomfortable for them. So what you want to keep is a personal distance. And that's usually a foot and a half to 4 feet. People that are not intimate with each other are usually comfortable in that zone. And so that's what you want to kind of establish with people. If you can move into within 2 feet roughly and 4 foot, and they have that conversation and they're comfortable with that, the rapport is working out well. If for some reason it's not working out, you want to create distance between you and them a little bit. Social distance, we know what that means today, right? Is usually 4 foot to 12 feet. And that's usually when you're talking to a group or you're, a small group of people and stuff. And then there's a public distance over 12 feet type of thing. But proxemics is really a big part of human, communication. So if you're talking with somebody and the rapport is working, it's okay to move up a little bit. Maybe that'll show a little bit of interest and stuff too. And you just want to, pay attention that is something. If they start moving up to you and you're uncomfortable, it's okay to back up a little bit. And you're communicating to them that that's uncomfortable. And that's how you start to establish a little bit about what's acceptable and what's not during the course of the communication. But another thing in terms of posturing is consider the environment that you're in, what we talked about earlier. Do they own the space? Do you own the space? Are you in their home? Maybe you want, if you're in a situation where you have a caseworker offsite, where maybe if it's uncomfortable, that maybe you want to find a neutral place to have the conversation or to have the meetings and stuff. That's one thing that our social workers use. If they're coming into your environment, for example, in cubicles, we do this in our medical staff and our medical examination rooms, for example. One of the things we try to do is keep the exit available to you. You don't want your exit available or blocked for any reason, but you want the clientele who are not in control and not familiar with that to see the exit and maybe even face the door. Because if a lot of people don't realize that when you come into a cubicle, you come into an office and the exit is behind you and you can't see it, people feel enclosed. They feel trapped, and that really picks up the tension level. So just in your posturing and your positioning and in ergonomics and the setting that you're in, you want to think about that. You want to leave either them facing the door and or accessible to the door. So those are little things you might want to look into. And if you're looking to do that in an interview type situation, one of the things you do is just go ahead and call your local law enforcement and call a detective who works in these environments and ask them to come in and do an assessment and what works and what doesn't work, and think about medical staff knows this stuff. And we use that, and we pulled our medical staff out to come in and review some of the office spaces, and they had these kind of techniques and available in terms of how to set up the cubicles for the caseworkers and stuff, because this is how they think. And they know this is how people think who are coming into their clinics, who are uncomfortable already because they're injured or whatever. So that's what we talk about, positioning and posturing, the kind of things you want to focus on. Your positioning, your posturing in terms of the environment and how you're communicating to them verbally and non-verbally. You can go ahead to the next slide. Let's talk about the verbal part of it. And this is really kind of interesting when you talk about this. So you're doing the nonverbal part, you're observing, you're listening, you're paying attention to posturing and your positioning as well. And it's everything's working out pretty well. The tension levels dropping down, and now at some point you want to start to engage verbally the communication to diffuse. And so what we're trying to do with the first part is to acknowledge their feelings, in a sense. What is causing them the stress level, and what are they upset about? And what's interesting about acknowledgement, you don't have to agree with it. You don't tell them necessarily, but all you have to do is acknowledge their feelings and why they're feeling the way they are. Repeat what they have to say. And once you acknowledge it, there's no reason for them to act out again. And so just simply acknowledging it doesn't have to be mutual agreement. You don't have to give a counter interpretation yet at this point. Just go ahead and acknowledge, what the problem is. My brother, my twin, is the head forester for JEA, the line company in Jacksonville, Florida. And he tells me this story about how one of his crews, who were all Paul Bunyan type, were calling him for help because they had a frail elderly woman on, addressing all of them and aggressively. And by the time he pulls up, they're all on top of their truck. And he's like, I got these Paul Bunyans on top of this truck, and this woman, who is certainly not a threat physically to them, is got them all up there and yelling at him. And he got out of his car and he says, ma'am, what's the problem? And she looked and she goes, they're cutting down the tree. And he goes, okay. And she goes, that's where the fairies live. And he's like, oh, okay, that's where the fairies live. Well, they didn't know and I didn't know. So all he did is acknowledge them and her, and she calmed right down. And then he explained that why they were cutting the tree is to make their home safe, and everything worked out just fine. And that's exactly what he did. So, and that's what happens in our jails too. When we get inmates who are upset because they were denied visitation or something, or they had a bad encounter with a family member, going in there and just acknowledging, the fact that they're upset, not necessarily agreeing with it, and there doesn't have to be agreement, but acknowledge it anyway, let them get out. And that validates them. That gives them respect and attention as well. And it opens up the continuation for the next part. So the next part, what you're going to do is invite some responses, and that's questions. Once you acknowledge them and they calm down a little bit and they understand that you at least acknowledged what their concerns are, questions can be anything: who, what, where, how, and when. Having them repeat things that they said when you were listening to them, when they were venting, and explaining things again, having them, now, when was that happen? When did this happen? That kind of thing. It doesn't really matter what kind of questions you ask at this point. Some will be obvious, and some of them, if you can't think of any, just start asking who, what, when, where, and why. What's your name again? How do your friends call you? How would you like to be called? Is it okay that I call you that way? And what's happening is you're beginning to talk with them and not at them. And again, that validates them a little bit, and it gets them involved in a discourse. But it also, like magic, they don't even realize what's happening when you start asking questions and they start to respond to it. You start to take control of the conversation, and you start to control the directionality of the conversation. They are responding to you rather than you responding to them. And that's a real catch. Once you get to that point and you start asking questions and they're responding to you, that's exactly what's happening. You're starting to take control of it. And that's real important. So the next part, once they start to answer your questions and they're starting to respond to you, and the responses are normal and understandable and reasonable, and things are working out okay, the next thing is once you want to get into is the choices. Now the choices is really where you really start to direct them what you can and can't do, or will not do. And what you do is you start to explain the reasons or for your actions or your non-actions, what you won't do. They don't have to agree, certainly, but it's important that the reasons have been given to them. And this is where you start to rationalize, I can do this, but what you try to do is you give them a choice, because once they make a choice, they own it. They start to take responsibility for the choices they make. So for example, if you tell somebody that they might have to leave at this point or something, one good example is to say, if you don't, you give them an alternative. And the alternative is usually more severe than what you want them to do. Like the county workers say, if you don't calm down, then I have to call a supervisor. If you don't calm down, another code worker might call the cops to come over, and it's okay for them to use us as the bad guys. So what they do is the consequences are usually worse than what you offer them. And those are where you're going to, again, during the questions and answers, you're going to get that kind of assessment while you're listening to them. But what you want them to do is to accept and make the choice to do what you need them to do. In terms of their conduct, in terms of their demeanor or whatever. And one of the techniques that works in our jail really well is when it gets to the point of choices, is when you have to, for example, give direction, to them. And how we start soft and then get, heavy if we need to. And usually it's as simple as this: ask, advise, and then order or tell. So you ask first. I'm going to ask you to do this. I'm going to ask you if you would, whatever it is you need them to do, and just ask them. You're not telling them. You're just being kind. You're being helpful. You're asking them for compliance in a way. And usually that's, people will respond very well to that. If they don't for some reason, and now they're becoming resistant, passively even, the next step is hey, you know what? I'm going to advise you this. I'm going to advise you, because you're stepping it up a little bit. You're still being kind. You're still being helpful. You're still being respectful. But once you get away from asking and advising them a little bit more, usually people understand, okay, the level of communication has changed here. This technique really does work in the jails. And then the last one is when maybe you asked them, they didn't listen, you advised them, they didn't listen. And the last one is a direction. Okay, I'm going to have to, unfortunately, I asked you nicely, I advised you the best I could, trying to be helpful here. But unfortunately, at this point, I'm going to have to tell you, and you go that route. And usually by the time it gets to that level, they've either complied, or that's when you need to bring in other resources. So that's just to keep in mind. So acknowledge what they have to say, let them, know that you understand. Go ahead and start asking questions, take control of the directionality of that, and have them start to respond to you. And that helps you to decide, the next part is to start giving choices for them. Let them make the choice, make the decision of what needs to be done, how they need to conduct themselves, make it their decision. And then they own it and take responsibility to it. And usually people will respond to that. Go ahead with the next one. Next slide. There you go. Mirroring, again, I just want to reinforce a little bit. Pay attention to this. If they start to, again, and the rapport they start to identify with you, and rapport starts to kick in, they will start to mirror you. They will start to mirror you in your tones and your expressions and your posturing. So you want to set that example. So again, if they're yelling at you, you want to talk low. And so hopefully they'll drop the tone too as well. Again, keep yourself in a non-threatening positioning and posturing. If you face them and they start to face you, that's good. If you're not crossing your arms and closing up for defense, in open postures, and they start to mirror you, again, it's working. Try this at home. I've actually had county workers tell me, I went home for lunch and I had a conversation with my daughter, and I'll be damned if that worked. One technique you can see where it's happened is just do this kind of thing when you're talking to somebody. And if the rapport is working in, they'll mirror that. They'll do the exact same thing, and that shows they're identifying with each other, and that's one thing you want to focus on. This is where you pay attention to what you're communicating in your body language, not just what they are. Reinforce positive responses. Go ahead and take the time to tell them, hey, I appreciate you not swearing at me anymore. Hey, I appreciate you talking low to me, and that kind of thing. I appreciate you listening to me now. at this point. I listen to you now, it's time to listen to me, and I appreciate that. So go ahead and reinforce that throughout the whole encounter, wherever and you have that opportunity. And it's okay to discourage negative responses as well. Hey, please, keep your tone down. Well, I can hear you just fine. I understand you're upset, but please don't yell at me. I can get yelled at home when all I want. I don't need it at home, at work here. Just that's another joke. So, those are kind of things. And again, with people swearing and stuff, because that's a level of threat. And you go ahead and tell them, hey, I'm not swearing at you. Please don't swear at me. And don't bring yourself down to that level and things like that. So it's okay. Pay attention to mirroring, reinforce positive behavior and responses, and discourage negative behavior through the encounter as well. And that's just setting expectations. That's all, for better rapport and better communications. So I kind of ran through that pretty quickly, but I think if you get the article on American jails, keep in mind that article was written for American jails. It was to share what's working in New York State jails and these techniques with other jail facilities across the country. It was published nationally. We got permission from American jails to have that available for you for this presentation or for this training. But when you read it, you'll see that it's written for a jail environment, but you can still apply those same things to your work environment as well. So if we get into questions and answers, I told David and Adam and Amanda that the first thing I have to tell you is you have the right to remain silent. No, just is the first thing. And if you ask me a question that I can't answer right away, I'll either make something up that sounds convincing, or you can get a hold of me through emails and stuff like that, and I can respond, through my work email as well. So how about some questions and answers?
Right now, we don't have any questions in the question and answer pod, but you're welcome to put them in. Again, drag your mouse near the bottom. You'll see a Q&A. Put a question in there. We'd be glad to answer your questions. We've got about 8 or 9 minutes if you want to ask any question on what Lieutenant Anderson talked about. While we're waiting for that, I did have one thing I was thinking about. Have you any thoughts about how people can do some of these techniques, especially when we're separated and we're not actually seeing each other? How do you do that over the phone?
Oh, and I'm glad you brought that up, because I talked to one municipality that had to do with the water authority, and they found that through the phone conversations that the verbal techniques actually work. They can't do the nonverbal part, obviously, but when they start to have somebody who calls because they got a complaint, because they're angry, they said that these are the techniques that work over the phone. They acknowledge people, they start asking questions, and next thing you know, they start giving choices, and so the verbal part works, that. If you're in a situation like maybe, a conference like this where you can see each other, you can do some of those other techniques, still leaning in a little bit, still is visible. They understand that. I don't know how that technique works, facing people and stuff. That kind of works, but yeah, the verbal part works just in phone conversations. And I never thought about that until they got back to me and said, wow, we teach all our phone communicators this. When you're looking about that, you might want to look at other resources to improve some of the training opportunities. Reach out to 911 facilities that you have. I'll tell you what, those people know how to listen, to observe. They're trained in it. You have one classification of call takers, and they talk over people that are excited, that don't know, aren't giving accurate information. They know how to pull that information out. They're listening to the background, what other people are there. There are animals in the mountain. Then they have to give that information to a dispatcher, who has to communicate that information to a law enforcement officer or a first responder in some way. And if you want to learn a little bit about communication, boy, ask 911 people to come in and maybe present to your coworkers and your supervisors. And another technique that works for me when we introduce these kind of topics is usually I'll introduce them to an audience of just supervisors. Have them buy into it first. Have them equate the information and how it can be tweaked before you give it to the workforce. So maybe do it as a supervisor training first. Have these people come in, and then after they buy into it and after they give their input, then you can develop it a little more stronger to the workforce to get out there. So that works pretty well.
Okay.
Boy that works for 911. And yeah, we have a lot of fun conversations about how the calls actually came in, depending on how we received it on my end. So, but that's just a really good resource when you're looking into, communication techniques.
Okay, cool. So we have some questions now. If a person doesn't want to listen to you, what is the best way to make them listen?
A lot of it has to do with power play and whose environment it is. If it's a coworker or not, but if it's a clientele and stuff, and they just don't want to listen, this is exactly where you can ask them. Let them vent first. Let them say what they need to say. And one of the techniques we do is, okay, I listen to you, and it's important. I understand what you're saying. Repeat what they told you and stuff. So again, acknowledgement, and then ask. That's where you get into the question. I'm going to ask you a question. I'm going to ask you to listen to me now. I listen to you. Now it's important that they let me talk for a minute. And so again, you're asking them. But then it gets to the point where if they're interfering with your ability to do, give them the service you need or to do your job, again, once they are not responding, again, that's where you're going to look at that observing and listening and saying, I can't get through to this guy. I need to get someone else here. I need to get a supervisor. And that helps you, most people, who are upset for whatever reason or another, once you start, to have these communications and talk to them, it usually starts to work out. They start to understand. But if some people, because of their mental state, because of their stress tolerance, because of their medications or off their meds or whatever, sometimes these people, you just got to pull in other resources, first responders, ambulance, or whatever, to come in. But
if they ignore and disregard you.
Yeah, that'll give you, if they disregard you, you're talking about that passive resistance, that's a level of threat, actually. So if they aren't responding, again, you're looking for normalcy, what's outside normalcy, it helps you engage. Do I need to engage or disengage at this point? But that's something certainly to pay attention to. And just keep in mind that them not listening to you is a level of threat. That's a passive level of threat.
With the increase of substance abuse, especially in the workforce, what guidance can you give for a spontaneous change of behaviors and confrontations?
Yeah, it's a whole nother topic when we get into workplace violence and things like that. And it's not just substance abuse. A lot of it has to do with what's going on in the life of these individuals in terms of domestic, relationships and stuff like that. You just don't have control of what happened that day, that night, the night before. One of the things we tell, for example, we tell medical staff when they go off site, it says you really need to get a situational awareness because you have no idea what happened on that street at that household last night. So one of the things to do is call law enforcement first and see if the law enforcement was in that neighborhood. Call community relations, find out, set yourself up because you're an authority figure. So one of the things you want to do on the workforce is really pay attention to what's going on in the life of your coworkers. What is their stress level that particular day? And if you, in the workforce, when I talk about confrontations between coworkers, one of the most important things to do is to early intervention. So you got to report things. You got to tell somebody when you start seeing things that are concerning to you in terms of the demeanor of a coworker or even a client, because again, just like I said, that slippery slope. If there is no engagement, if it doesn't get checked, if there is no intervention, that conduct or that problem is typically going to become more frequent and it's going to become worse. So reporting is really, really important. Bring other people involved. There are so many resources we have available to the workforces today to help people that are in substance abuse, that are in domestic violence situations and stuff like that, that can assist them, that they don't even think about reaching out to it. So the best thing I can tell you, if you have a client or a coworker that's showing signs that are concerning to you, get other people involved, get some professional people involved, get your supervisors involved, and go ahead and report it. It's sometimes the best thing you can do to protect yourself, your coworkers, and them. Give them the resources that they need and assist them. That's a great question.
Okay, got time for one more, I think. And this is a good one. If you're having a heated problem, mostly verbal, with a portion of your crew, would you separate them and deal with them individually or as a whole?
So you're a supervisor and you're having a crew that's having issues. Yeah. Okay.
They're yelling at each other essentially. Yeah.
Definitely separate them. Again, posturing and positioning. Once you start to separate people, let's say they're mad at each other, so they're in the intimate distance yelling at each other. You start to create that posturing positioning, moving them into a social distance. You're moving them away from each other. The threat level is reduced. So I would reduce them. So certainly, back them away, and then engage them separately and stuff like that. And it just diffuses, the whole thing. That's a great question too. I can see that happening. It's like roll call every morning for me. No, I'm just kidding. My guys are great. Yeah, definitely separate them because the group dynamics take into place. That's one thing we didn't even talk about. But that's a certain part about human demeanor is group dynamics and how they react to each other, how the group will reinforce them subtly in one way or the other. So definitely, if you have a large, a group dynamics going on. You want to separate that and break that up. And
That's what they tell you in refereeing, is you break
yeah,
people apart, because you
yeah.
leave them as a group, they all join each other. Yep.
And when we get to a fight, we let them knock themselves around a little bit,
I'm
first.
tired.
No,
Yeah.
I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding about that. But those are great questions. Wow.
Well, I want to thank you on behalf of the Local Roads Program for joining us today and giving us your insights. It was very useful. The handout will be up on our website, and for those who were here most of the time, you'll get a certificate. I wish I could give you an engineering PDH for those who want them, but this class doesn't meet it because of the way the rules work. So we'll get you a certificate. And again, thank you, Lieutenant, for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. Nice to get out of the office once in a while.
Nice job. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.